Horror story. The journey began in the dry heat of a summer afternoon. The sun hung low over the fields, casting long, warped shadows across the gravel road as I turned onto the familiar path to my grandfather's house. It had been years since I'd visited, the place looming large in my childhood memories like some great beast slumbering beneath layers of dust and age. The house itself was a grand old thing built long before I was born. Its roof sagged in some places and the paint peeled away in thick strips, like the very skin of the house was sloughing off. Tall grass swayed in the breeze, almost concealing the stone path that led to the front door. The place seemed more alive than I remembered, vines creeping up the sides of the house, curling around the window frames and climbing toward the roof like skeletal fingers. Something about it made me feel watched, though I couldn't tell from where. With a deep breath, I stepped up to the door, the creak of the ancient wood beneath my feet strangely amplified in the otherwise dead silence. I pushed it open, the old hinges protesting with a low groan that echoed through the empty halls. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with a mix of dust and the faint, familiar scent of my grandfather's aftershave, a biting smell, a blend of cedar and something sharper, almost metallic. As I walked further into the dim house, I was struck by how still everything felt, as if time itself had stopped here. The furniture lay exactly as it had when I was a child, covered in protective sheets that had yellowed with age. My footsteps stirred up small clouds of dust that danced in the thin streams of light filtering through the dirty windows. I explored each room slowly, taking in the forgotten relics of my grandfather's life. Old books with cracked spines lined the walls, and strange objects filled the shelves, bronze figurines of animals in unnatural poses, a faded map of a country I couldn't name, and jars of preserved creatures floating in murky liquid. Each item seemed to tell its own strange, half-forgotten story. But it was in the corner of his bedroom that my gaze fell upon the object that drew me in most. It was a large chest, its wood dark and polished, standing in stark contrast to the dusty surroundings. Ornate carvings of intricate patterns snaked across its surface, patterns that seemed almost too detailed, as though etched with some unnatural precision. At its center was a lock, the brass still gleaming, untouched by time's decay. I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to reach out and touch it, but as I extended my hand, the air around me shifted. A dense, heavy presence seemed to press down on me, filling the room with a weight that was both oppressive and oddly watchful. It felt as though the very house itself was holding its breath, waiting, observing. Despite the growing sense of dread, I couldn't resist. I knelt beside the chest, running my fingers over the carvings, tracing the spirals and whorls. The wood was cold, colder than it should have been, and I felt a faint vibration under my fingertips, like a heartbeat thrumming deep within the chest. I tried to shake off the sensation, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the chill crept up my arm, seeping into my bones. I gave the lid a gentle tug, testing the lock, and felt the slightest give before it resisted. My eyes swept the room, and that's when I noticed the small, rusty key hanging on a nail above the dresser. It seemed out of place, too deliberate in its positioning, as though left there for someone, left there for me. As I stood, reaching for the key, the floorboards beneath my feet groaned in protest. The shadows seemed to deepen, gathering around me, thickening in the corners of the room. The weight in the air intensified, pressing down on my shoulders, making each breath feel heavier, slower. But I didn't hesitate. My fingers closed around the key, cold and rusted, its metal pitted and stained with age. As I held it, a sharp chill seeped into my hand as if the key itself carried a dormant, ancient cold, a sensation so profound it sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was just my nerves, that it was nothing more than an old piece of metal. But the heavy silence in the room seemed to deepen, pressing in around me, as if the very air disapproved of what I was about to do. With a sense of both trepidation and strange exhilaration, I knelt before the chest, carefully slipping the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, the teeth of the key aligning with a mechanical precision that defied the age of both lock and key. My hand hovered for a moment, uncertain. Somewhere deep inside, a warning bell clanged, muted but insistent. Yet, some invisible force compelled me forward, a whisper just on the edge of my consciousness urging me, prodding me to turn the key. With a slow, deliberate twist, I turned it. The lock gave a soft click, a sound so faint I almost imagined it. But as the lock released, I felt something inexplicable, a subtle shift inside me, as though something dormant had awakened, brushing against the edges of my mind like a shadow unfurling. The air around me grew dense, almost syrupy, as if thickening with an unseen presence. I inhaled deeply, my breath slow and steady, but as I did, it felt as though I was exhaling something more than air. My breath left me with a strange heaviness, a part of me slipping out along with it, dissolving into the silence around the chest. The sensation was oddly freeing yet deeply unsettling, as if I'd surrendered some small vital part of myself without knowing why. The chest seemed to respond, a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrating through the wood, like the distant murmur of a creature rousing from sleep. My hand trembled as I gripped the lid, slowly lifting it. The hinges creaked, the sound splitting the silence like the groan of something ancient and pained. The lid rose with a weight that defied its appearance, each inch a struggle against some invisible resistance. And then, as the chest opened fully, I was met with a single object lying at the bottom, a pale, weathered envelope. Its edges were frayed, its surface stained with years of dust and age, as though it had been waiting here for someone, waiting for me. I reached for it, but as my fingers brushed against the brittle paper, the chest emitted a faint sound like a whisper, a sigh, or was it a moan? The sound was soft, almost intimate, like the low murmur of a voice just out of reach. But there was a menace in it too, a subtle threat that vibrated in my bones, warning me to leave whatever lay inside alone. My heart pounded, my fingers hesitating over the envelope, but something deeper, more primal, pushed me onward. I lifted the envelope out of the chest, feeling a strange resistance as if the chest itself didn't want to let go. My fingers traced the delicate, worn paper, noting the strange symbols scrawled across its surface. Symbols I didn't recognize, yet they sparked a strange familiarity, an echo of something I couldn't quite place. With a deep breath, I carefully tore open the envelope, my hands nearly trembling. Inside, folded with a care that seemed reverent, was a single sheet of parchment. I unfolded it slowly and there it was, a map. The lines were faded, ink bleeding along creases worn from countless years. The paper smelled of age, of secrets long buried, and as I held it, I could almost feel its history humming beneath my fingers. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The map depicted a series of landmarks I couldn't recognize, gnarled trees, crumbling stone pillars, a stream that seemed to wind endlessly. But at the center was a small, crude marking, an X, scratched into the parchment with a fierce, almost desperate hand. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling growing within me. I could leave it here, close the chest, return the key and walk away. But the thought was fleeting, dissolving as quickly as it had come. I couldn't shake the sensation that this map was bound to me now, that whatever path it laid out, I was already committed to follow it. The air around me seemed to press closer, an invisible force urging me to move, to act. With the map in hand, I rose, barely aware of the creak of the floorboards beneath me. I tucked the map into my jacket, almost feeling its weight settle against my chest, a cold, insistent presence that seemed to pulse in time with my own heartbeat. Leaving the chest open behind me, I made my way back through the house, out into the thick, humid air of the evening. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the landscape as I started walking, my footsteps crunching over gravel and brittle grass. The road before me twisted and turned in unfamiliar ways, the landscape blurring as though the very world around me was shifting to match the lines of the map. The house behind me grew smaller, receding into the distance as though pulling itself away from me, retreating as I moved toward the unknown destination marked by that crude X. The path carried me deeper into the woods, drawing me under a dense canopy of spruce trees that seemed to close in around me. The ancient trees stood like silent sentinels, their trunks thick and gnarled, towering high above me with branches that tangled together, blocking out what little light remained. Their twisted forms seemed to loom over the path, and as I walked beneath them, they felt more like watchers than trees, stern and immovable, their shadows stretching long and dark across my path. I imagined their branches reaching down, pulling at me, deterring me from continuing on the path laid out by the map. They seemed displeased, almost frowning, as though aware of the purpose that had drawn me into their midst. Yet I kept moving forward, my fingers brushing against the rough bark as I passed, each step muffled by the dense underbrush. The deeper I ventured, the more the world I'd known seemed to fall away, replaced by this otherworldly silence, thick and undisturbed. It was as though the forest had wrapped me in a cocoon of isolation, swallowing up every sound except the soft crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my feet. An uneasy thrill ran through me, there was no turning back now. I was far from the house, alone in this strange, watchful forest, with only the faint light filtering through the spruce needles to guide my way. Ahead, I noticed something flicker, a small flash no bigger than a spark but unmistakably there. I stopped, squinting through the darkened grove, and there it was again, a tiny glimmer of light, like the glint of a mirror catching the last rays of the sun. I pulled the map from my pocket, feeling its rough edges against my fingertips, and looked down at the faint, sketched markings. My pulse quickened. The small flash seemed to correspond with a point marked just before the central meadow, the very spot where the cross was etched into the map. Bracing myself, I pressed forward, the silence around me thickening as I approached the light. My breath felt shallow, a cold tension coiling in my chest. Soon, the trees parted and I found myself on the edge of a clearing, the light now clearly visible across a meadow covered in swaying grass. The sun dipped lower, casting a reddish glow that stretched long shadows across the open field. The light I'd seen was coming from something metallic staked into the ground, a makeshift cross, rusted and weathered, marking a place of significance only known to the one who had set it there. Beyond it, at the far edge of the meadow, stood an old house. The structure was skeletal and abandoned, its roof sagging, beams exposed where wood had rotted away with time. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring out at me from the face of the forest. The air grew cold as I approached, and a shiver ran down my spine, though the evening air was still and humid. I felt as though the house itself was alive, aware of my approach, silently waiting as I took each step forward. The closer I got, the more it seemed to grow, swelling like some monstrous creature that had slumbered for ages and was now awakening to my presence. The sun was slipping quickly beneath the horizon, its last light casting the house in a blood-red glow that made the walls seem to bleed. Shadows pooled around it, clinging to its sides like dark veins spreading across the decrepit structure. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to leave this place before night fell and the forest consumed it in complete darkness. But I found myself rooted to the spot, torn between the primal fear rising in my chest and the strange, insistent pull that had brought me here. I unfolded the map again, hoping for some guidance, some clue as to what I should do next. Turning it over, I noticed faint lettering on the opposite side, letters faded and scrawled in the shaky, uneven handwriting of my grandfather. I squinted, trying to decipher the message. The letters were smeared in places as if written in haste, or perhaps with a trembling hand. Slowly the words came into focus. "Here my secret won't stop him." I read it again, the words sending a chill through me. "Here my secret won't stop him." It was both a warning and an invitation, something veiled in mystery, a challenge to complete what he had left unfinished. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, the words echoing in my mind with a strange finality. The house loomed before me, its broken windows glinting in the dim light, and I knew that I couldn't walk away. My grandfather's warning had not been intended to keep me from entering. If anything, it seemed he'd known that one day I would follow this path, that I would feel this same relentless pull and come to this place to finish what he had started. Whatever had driven him to leave that message, it now drove me forward, one step closer to the house. With a resolve that felt not entirely my own, I reached out for the door handle, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. It was rough and rusted, yet it felt solid, almost unnaturally so, as though bound to the frame by some unseen force. My hand lingered there, and for a brief moment, I hesitated, my mind racing with half-formed thoughts and shadows of fears I couldn't yet name. But the pull was stronger, insistent, driving me beyond reason and fear. I tightened my grip on the handle, bracing myself as I prepared to open the door, feeling as though some invisible boundary lay between me and whatever awaited within. A gust of wind swept across the meadow, whistling through the cracked boards of the house and stirring the tall grass around me, filling the air with the scent of decay and damp earth. The world around me seemed to hold its breath, the forest, the meadow, even the sky darkening in solemn anticipation. And then, with a final surge of determination, I turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. The staleness of the air hit me first, a suffocating mix of dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, the light from the dying sun barely penetrating the dim interior. Stepping across the threshold, I felt a strange shift beneath my feet, as if the old wood itself had drawn a deep breath, waiting for something. I took a few cautious steps inside, letting my eyes adjust, but before I could make out the details, the floor groaned sharply beneath me. In that split second, the ancient wood gave way, the boards splintering with a sickening crack, and before I could react, I was falling. The darkness swallowed me whole as I plunged downward, the walls rushing past in a blur. The impact was harsh and jarring. My body hit cold stone, the wind knocked from my lungs as I lay sprawled in the pitch-black abyss below. I took a shaky breath, my chest heaving as I struggled to make sense of where I was. The air here was even thicker, cloying with an earthy dampness that clung to the back of my throat. My mind raced, disoriented by the fall and the oppressive darkness pressing in around me. Groping for my pocket, I pulled out my phone and fumbled to switch on the flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the stone walls that surrounded me. The basement. The light revealed rough stone walls, their surfaces slick with moisture and coated in a thick film of grime. I panned the beam slowly around, trying to get my bearings, the silence of the place pressing down like a weight. The dim light bounced off something metallic in the corner, and as I moved closer, I realized what it was. A tank. An actual military tank. It sat there, hulking and silent, its surface corroded and weathered by time. The tank was cramped into a corner of the basement, its dull, tarnished shell looming in the shadows like some slumbering beast. I stared at it, my mind struggling to piece together the absurdity of it. Why would my grandfather have a tank in his basement? Was he a collector? Or perhaps a veteran who had brought this relic of war home with him? But this was no souvenir. The tank looked like it hadn't seen light in decades, forgotten in this underground vault. I moved around the tank, my flashlight revealing more of the strange assortment stored down here. Just beyond the tank, I noticed a doorway leading to another room, and as I stepped closer, the beam illuminated a stockpile of objects stacked neatly against the walls. Shells, heavy artillery shells, sat in rows, their dull brass casings reflecting my light in a muted gleam. I felt a rush of cold dread trickling down my spine. My grandfather had to have been part of something big, something dangerous. But why keep all this? The oppressive silence grew heavier, a strange feeling of trespass swelling within me as I ventured further into the basement. I told myself that my grandfather might have been a veteran, perhaps one who couldn't let go of the tools of his past life. But something about this didn't feel right, didn't feel like anything a soldier would store in his house. Beyond the shells and the tank, I found a pile of cardboard boxes, each one sealed with duct tape and labeled with dates in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I knelt down and pried open one of the boxes, my heart racing as I pulled out the contents. There were passports, stacks of them, each bearing names I didn't recognize, faces of strangers staring back at me with expressions frozen in time. They were all from different countries, different ages and appearances, each one as unfamiliar as the last. I flipped through them, and as I did, a sense of horror began to build in my chest. The pile grew larger as I sifted through them, each passport a silent testament to a life I didn't know, a story I would never understand. Beside the passports were objects: a scarf, a pair of glasses, a faded photograph of a young woman with a hesitant smile. Each one was meticulously labeled with dates and strange, cryptic codes. I felt as though I was looking at some twisted trophy collection, each item telling a silent, horrifying story that only its collector understood. Then, at the bottom of one of the boxes, I found a list, a single sheet of paper yellowed and frayed. I lifted it carefully, my eyes scanning the scrawled handwriting. The heading read, "Confirmed Targets." Beneath it, names were listed in neat columns, each name marked with the same strange symbols and dates as the objects. Some names had a line drawn through them, and a few had unsettling, cryptic notes scribbled beside them. Verified, incomplete, relocation required. My heart hammered as I read down the list, each name a reminder of a person who had seemingly disappeared into the pages of this terrible ledger. Before I could even begin to process it, I heard the sound of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, the old floorboards creaking with each step. Panic surged through me as I quickly extinguished my flashlight, plunging myself back into the suffocating darkness. I held my breath, my ears straining to catch every sound as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped directly above the broken floorboards where I'd fallen through. I froze, barely daring to breathe. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then something dropped down from above. A bundle, small and compact, landed with a soft thud near the corner of the room, and as I watched in horror, it began to move, unwrapping itself to reveal what looked like a length of rope, coiled like a serpent in the dim light. A cold realization dawned on me. I hadn't come here by accident. I'd been lured, led by the strange message, the map, the objects carefully positioned to catch my attention. My grandfather hadn't left these things for me, someone else had. I felt the dread settle like ice in my veins, the suffocating weight of realization pressing down on me. Before I could react, the footsteps resumed, descending the stairs slowly, deliberately, until they reached the bottom, where a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. I barely made out the figure in the dim light, but I could see their eyes gleaming, fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. "Welcome," the figure said, their voice low, almost mocking. "I was wondering when you'd finally get here." My mind raced, each piece of evidence clicking together with a sickening clarity. The passports, the list of names, the dark, hidden basement filled with relics of war, it all pointed to something horrifying, something incomprehensible. My grandfather had kept secrets, but these weren't his. He had been a pawn, a cog in a machine far darker than I could have imagined. The figure stepped forward, and before I could scramble back, they grabbed me, twisting my arms behind my back as they forced me against the cold stone wall. I struggled, the rough grip on my wrists tightening as they bound my hands with the rope, securing me tightly. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," they whispered, leaning close, their breath hot against my ear. "But you're going to find out soon enough." Bound and helpless, I felt myself pulled further into the darkness, the last vestiges of light from my phone's flashlight casting twisted shadows on the walls as it lay forgotten on the floor. And as the footsteps echoed in the cold, damp chamber, a single horrifying thought lodged itself in my mind. I was in the hands of something unspeakable, something that thrived on the secrecy and darkness of this twisted place.